gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker. I invite Professor Gregory Hadley to turn on his webcam. Gregory Hadley is a professor of sociolinguistics and Western cultural studies at Niigata University here in Japan. He is also a visiting fellow at Kellogg College, Oxford. He's written widely in applied linguistics and is the author of Grounded Theory in Applied Linguistics Research, a Practical Guide, published by Routledge. Without further ado then, I would like to hand over to Professor Gregory Hadley.
Thanks, Evan. Right, well, hello everybody from all over the world, and welcome to my office here in Japan. I hope that this talk today will be able to provide you with some new ideas and some new insights as we think about the issue of extensive reading. Now, extensive reading, or ER, is an approach to teaching and learning in the second language where learners will read large amounts of material that's within their range of proficiencies. So students will read small books called graded readers, and the focus is to encourage reading for pleasure. And teachers are supposed to avoid explicitly teaching vocabulary or grammar. This is discouraged, as well as testing. It tends to be discouraged. According to Day and Bamford, doing such things would rob the students of their joy of reading. Dow's 2014 survey meta-analysis of many ER research studies presents some pretty compelling evidence that ER can have great potential for fostering better vocabulary learning, faster reading speeds, deeper language comprehension, and students tend to gain self-confidence as they see that they are progressing while they read for enjoyment. However, most of this research is based on the study of students who have succeeded in ER courses. There's been much less research on what's been happening with those less successful learners, those who drop out in midstream. And there's also, in my opinion, too much of a focus on ER in the classroom and much less attention on the reading processes and history that students bring to the classroom. Much of the research, which matches my interviews with ER teachers, is also telling me that regardless, most are having a really hard time getting students to actually read extensively. And this will continue to be a major challenge. Okay, so I work in the sociology of language teaching, and I became curious about what was happening with our students in extensive reading classes. I got a grant from the Japanese government to conduct a grounded theory study on extensive reading. Now, we don't have a whole lot of time to go into the details of the grounded theory methodology, so let's just suffice it to say that grounded theory is a qualitative or mixed methodology that begins with an open-ended exploration of issues as they are presented by the people in the field. And then this will, over time, this will be followed by a more focused investigation of the main issues that take place, which then leads to the development of an explanatory theory that will help people gain a better understanding about what's happening in some area of human activity. But right now, my study is still in the level of a focused investigation. I've got a long way to go, but I do have some preliminary findings that I want to share with you today. Now, this theory has been developed so far from 22 informant interviews. Research methodologist John Cresswell has written that 20 to 60 interviews are sufficient. And in my personal conversations with him, recently he's been saying and lowering that notion that even 20 to 30 interviews is enough for getting the main ideas of the main features of a grounded theory. So in this presentation, I'm going to present the grounded theory of extensive reading I'm developing, but only in very broad brushstrokes. I'm going to tell you about the main processes that have been conducted from this research, but time is limited. So I won't have time to present you with interview excerpts or some of the other field data that I've been collecting. And after discussing the theory, I want to suggest some ways that you can use these new insights in your ER classes. And as we begin, I should say that for those of you who are unfamiliar with a grounded theory study and the methodology, grounded theories highlight human action, interaction, and social processes. So the findings of this methodology are are more concerned with what people do rather than what they think or feel. Getting into the emotional lives is something that happens more in the methodology known as phenomenology. Now, granted, some grounded theories, especially in psychology, do enter the human emotions and thought process, but in other fields, most grounded theories don't do this so much. Anyway, the key social process that seems to run through the entire extensive reading experience is that of avidization. Now, avidization is a word that I've developed for this study. It means the process by which a certain activity becomes meaningfully integrated within one's professional, social, or personal life. With relation to extensive reading in second language learning, avidization takes place when reading is no longer a task. Right? It happens when extensive reading becomes either a vital means for working towards someone's particular language learning goals, or when it becomes a renewable source of personal enjoyment and fulfillment. Now, I've decided to use this term avidization to get around the more commonly used terms such as reading motivation, because the term motivation has been so problematized over the years. And it's in teaching circles, you have to work so hard to try to explain what you mean by motivation. It could mean anything from an internally intrinsic desire to do something regardless of external rewards, or it could just mean simply getting students to conform to our wishes. Okay, so let's look at ER avidization in greater detail. The three main processes that take place in the trajectory of ER avidization are those of info grazing, and then story hunting and book mining. Okay, let's look deeper. Info grazing is a process where a person simply reads to get by. They're passive readers, meaning that they read something when it's presented to them, say as an advertisement or a billboard, or completing tasks in their daily lives, for example, cooking an instant dinner, or following the instructions on how to purchase a train ticket from a machine, or reading the back of a cereal box briefly while eating. It might help as a visual metaphor to see infograzing as sitting in a stasis, sort of floating around in a thick fluid with a rather tough membrane around it. And there are many things that can work to keep a person solidly in the practice of infograzing. And these are time framing, stasis management, and neurological diversity. Let's look at these briefly. In terms of time framing, whether or not a person becomes avidized towards extensive reading depends largely on how they view time. Do they view it as a limited resource, or do they view time as not an issue at all when it comes to reading? Depending on the degree of pressure that one is feeling with regard to this, it will either keep a person from reading or put them on a specific path towards one or another type of avidization. Now, neurological diversity refers to the way that our brains are wired differently and how this affects how we read. For example, dyslexia is widely known among teachers, but in places such as here in Japan, it's rarely diagnosed, but this can have an effect on whether or not a person will want to persevere in extensive reading classes. In recent years, neurological research has studied the condition known as aphantasia. And this is the inability to imagine pictures in your mind when you hear someone tell you a story or when you read a book. The opposite extreme of this is hyperphantasia, which is an imagination so vivid that it can be almost indistinguishable from reality. Now, all of us are on a climb somewhere between these two extremes of aphantasia and hyperphantasia. But in most cases, we're somewhere in the middle. But there may be 30%, at least, about 30% of people in our classes who have a much fuzzier mind's eye, and maybe as many as 10% of students who may not be able to see anything at all in their mind's eye when they read books. Now, in extreme cases, this can keep a person from extensive reading, but in lesser extreme cases, it may nudge a person towards different types of avidation strategies, which we'll be looking at in just a few moments. Now, stasis pressure relates to the many other things in a person's life that will work against the urge to read. This can be an uncomfortable living environment or a certain distracting emotional state. It can be the priorities that a person has in their life that leave little time for reading. They might find greater satisfaction in hobbies that require outdoor activities, and They prefer not to be, as they would say or think about it, sitting inside just reading a book. So these factors are part of this fabric of thick membrane pushing down on a person that can keep them floating in the stasis of infograzing. However, one important factor that we must remember is that reading is both learned and maintained in relationships. Now, many of us have memories of being read to by one of our parents or a significant person in our early lives. We learn to read from others, and we learn to read in community. It's that relational aspect of reading that can drive students either towards building connections with groups that they want to join, or perhaps regaining something that was once lost that they had with their parents when their parents used to read to them, but now they've grown up and they don't have that experience anymore. Or maybe because they've lost some other important relationship in their life and they'd like to regain that. So this movement from infograzing happens when others help a person to move them in relationship to a place here, which, as my visual metaphor shows, is a sort of a space that has many different holes or entry points. You see, everyone is different, and it is something of a hit or miss experience as to whether somebody actually finds through reading some space of entry. For each person, it's different. And this is one aspect of avidization in extensive reading that we just cannot control, but we can observe it when it happens. So when a person does find some area of interest or filled need, what happens is something that takes place, which is what I call the quickening. The quickening is an experience that all enthusiastic readers go through, though some may not remember it because they were quite young when it first happened. But others have reported to me that it has happened later in life. And we hope that some of our students will experience in extensive reading classes. And you will know that it has happened when you see a certain student beginning the process of reading more intensively and silently reading more extensively. It's like something has reached critical mass within them in terms of reading. Something is sparked and invigorated inside them, and they're no longer just infograzing. It's a type of conversion experience. It transforms them towards wanting to read more. Now, the quickening can lead then to something that I have called the hungering. Now, this is a stage in avidization where a person begins to have a deep sense of emptiness when they are not reading. Some describe it as an addiction, others as a deep ache. And some people in this study have described the world as so dull, so painful, or so disappointing that they want to enter another place. It's a longing to slip out of this world and to enter the book world where they can find more satisfaction and fulfillment. Now, this hungering will take them on a path towards one form of avidization called story hunting. Story hunting is often a process that people would describe as becoming an avid reader. Story hunters read for enjoyment and for spiritual fulfillment. They are often connoisseurs of specific genres. They may have emotional relationships with the characters in a book and are often fans of certain authors. They often tend more on the spectrum towards hyperphantasia, meaning that as they read, it's as if they are, to varying degrees, seeing a movie in their minds and experiencing the story almost as if they were there. In terms of time, there's never a question of not having enough time for reading. It's more of a question of whether they have time for other tasks. They will often identify, sometimes with a bit of pride, that they are avid readers. But this form of avidization is not a constant. People can become de-avidized. This can happen if significant people in their lives put pressure on them to do other things besides reading for pleasure. This can be teachers, for example, or parents who say, stop doing this, you need to be doing this instead. Sometimes it's an emotional trauma or a change in living conditions that can affect their story hunting. But it is when story hunters reconnect with that first experience of feeling hungry for stories and of that enjoyment they had at that time in their lives that the hungering can be revived and they can be re-avidized. But this is only one type of avidization. The quickening can also lead others to something which I call the thirsting. This is a thirst for knowledge, a thirst for attainment, a thirst for that demands satisfaction. And this means reading a lot. This search for valuable knowledge and insight leads to a type of avidization that I call book mining. Now, book mining, as the term implies, relates to extensive reading as a means of accomplishing or attaining something of personal value. This could be to improve their qualifications, or oftentimes maybe to find out some knowledge that will help them in other classes. In terms of extensive reading, frequently you will hear students tell you that they are reading in order to improve their English language skills. It's reading in order to get something else. Reading is the ladder by which they climb to higher levels. It's this thirst that they have for specific knowledge. The tendency among book miners, of course, is to have greater levels of aphantasia. Now, not all aphantasics are book miners, but those who have this condition will focus more on concepts and meanings rather than pictures. And this may lead them to look for specific information to address their thirst for answers. And book miners may be very interested in improving their lives in some way. So they are often reading biographies or self-help books. So book miners see time as limited. So as a limited resource, book miners may be used to using various strategies through technology and skimming and such for trying to get what they want from a book. And an interesting aspect of book mining is that those who are book miners rarely identify themselves as avid readers and even feel a sense of shame that they should be doing something else more. However, they read a lot. They read voraciously, and they're looking, and when they're looking for answers or striving for goals, they read just as much as story hunters. But de-avidization takes place when a book miner, the reader, has gotten what they were looking for. When in extensive reading, they find that they've improved enough for their own personal satisfaction, or they've gotten some other thing that they were striving for, the thirst is satisfied. And many ER classes, you know, mine as well, we have systems where the students are encouraged to read a lot, and this is measured through word counts, like they will get credit for passing small quizzes for the books they have read and be awarded certain numbers of words in an account. In my classes, we have a goal of reading 200,000 words in a semester. Now, students who use a book mining strategy are capable of not only reaching, but rapidly surpassing these goals. But once they have done that, or once the class is over, with the pressure and that goal out of their lives, even though they say they might want to continue to read, they won't. But they can be re-avidized with a new goal or a new thirst for knowledge. Okay, now there's a lot going on in this theory, but we just don't have time to go into great detail. But this trajectory from infograzing to story hunting or book mining are the major features of avidization in extensive reading. And it's likely that our students bring these tendencies from the first language reading practices they've already developed into the ER classroom. And these can either support or subvert their response to second language extensive reading. Okay, you're beginning to wonder, yeah, okay. So what can I do with this? You know, like I'm busy and I've got to get to class. I've got a class coming up. So cut to the chase. Okay. So I think that there are some important takeaways from this developing grounded theory. Okay, so with the new terminology of this theory, now you have ways to identify what has already been going on in your classes. If you can name it, you can see it. And it heightens our awareness that students have a relationship and a history with reading before they come to our extensive reading classes. And we can work with what they bring to the class. For the students coming to your classes, we'll be able to identify whether they are prone towards infograzing, book mining, or story hunting. We can do this by asking about their first language reading experience. I mean, do they like to read? Do they find some deeper purpose in reading? If not, the student might be engaged primarily in infograzing. If the student likes reading, in what way? Well, do they want to accomplish a professional, academic, or personal interests goal? Well, the student might be inclined towards book mining. The student says that he or she loves to read because that's just what they like to do. Very possibly the student is a story hunter. Knowing this can help us to develop strategies to move students along the way towards better avidization. Now, an infograzer might be in your ER class because it was required, or because they needed a credit and your class was the only space that was open in their schedule. Getting an infograzer to read means helping them to develop relationships with other students in the class and with you as a teacher. Now, this can be done through caring and sharing activities, and this will help the students to express their interests. You can uncover these and find out ways then to inspire them to move towards those goals. As they relate to you and to others in class, well, you can suggest graded readers that are at their level and that fit their interests. This might help move them closer to being quickened, and it might then help them to decide whether they want to book mine or hunt for stories. Now, it will be important to challenge students who are infograzers about their attitudes related to time. Yeah, help them to find strategies for making good use of their time. And students who are story hunters and book miners can work together with you as informants during activities where they can share strategies for how they read extensively. Moving students away from infograzing towards either story hunting or book mining requires individual attention, because what quickens a student towards avidization will be unique to each person, but it's a worthwhile goal and it's a worthwhile task for us as teachers in extensive reading. Now, students who frequently use a book mining strategy will need clear goals, reading targets, and measures such as speed reading tests or book tracking and testing platforms such as X-Reading or M-Reader. It is important, though, not to go over the top and encourage them too much, because striving for the goals is what drives them to read more. So having word reading goals is great, but you also need to remember that these goals will be tempting for book miners. They may want to try to choose more difficult books because they can get higher word counts more quickly. So don't let them do this, because they won't be able to read as much, of course. And you can't let them get shortcuts to their goals, because they will easily become de-avidized. Essentially, structure and gentle pressure will help them to continue reading, but don't be disappointed if they stop reading immediately after the class is over. Ironically, the strategies of structure and assessment with constant measurement can have the opposite effect on story hunters. Story hunters tend to be very particular about the genre that they read, the types of things they like to read. They know what they want. They don't need any help getting there. So a better strategy might be to encourage story hunters to share their experiences about reading when you have activities in your extensive reading classes, and let them share their thoughts about what they have read to other infograzers and book miners, because this at times can lead to further quickening, to further thirsting, and to more hungering. Okay, so as we look to the future, this theory does bring up some critical considerations. For example, online platforms like M-Reader and X-Reading tend to work very well with book mining, but how can these be adjusted to foster more story hunting? And should we encourage students to switch strategies? I mean, for example, what if you have a student who is fixated on goals and reads a lot, but doesn't really seem to be enjoying the process? It's more of an obsession to read, and to get to some goal. What if we try to get that student to read more for pleasure and to actually maybe read less? What if we have a student who reads for pleasure, but is only reading very little, and there's no evidence of improvement in terms of reading speeds or vocabulary acquisition? Should we encourage that student to read more and to read more widely? Should we try to chart that student a little bit more and just see if their vocabulary and reading speeds are improving? There's no easy answers to these questions, because it might be that some students will become de-avidized. But something I should say, because we haven't had any time to go into great detail to drill down into this grounded theory, and it's something that you know, is that many people, myself included, will use story hunting at certain times in the week and book mining at other times during the week. It's not a one or other sort of thing. And our students will not always do one or the other, especially in the first language. But at the same time, with the added stress and challenges of reading in a second language, for students in extensive reading, they might be more prone to do one process more than another when they are engaged in extensive reading classes. And finally, most of the education, with its emphasis on measurement and goals and structure and having so many things to do, all of these things tend to drive us whether it's in the first language or the second language, drive us towards book mining and tends to push things such as story hunting to the edge. So in ER classes, what can we do to foster more story hunting, or at least to foster more reading that is less of a sense of competition and reading that takes place more in a sense of community, that takes place with relationships with each other and with the books that we are reading. Okay, I would love to share more with you, but I think I'd like to stop at this moment and ask if any of you have any questions for the remainder of this session.
Thank you very much, Greg. That was a fantastic session. We've actually had quite a lot of questions that have come into the Q&A box. Just a couple of points. First of all, the certificate of information is specifically for this session, and we will be putting that into the chat box and giving you a little bit of information right at the end of the Q&A. So just stay around for that if you would. Also, there were a few questions that were related more to primary and secondary school students. And I would recommend that if you are teaching that age range, then you join our schools online conference, which will be happening towards the end of November. Please do check our website for further information. But what I would like to do then is just picking out a few of the common themes from the Q&A. One common theme actually that I saw from a number of people, Mustafa and Zubeda in particular, were what are ways that teachers can use to overcome the kind of obstacles or the motivation of students not really wanting to read. And in fact, there was one question right at the end, which was how can you essentially convince students that it's worth their time reading when they have other pressures and other things that they have to do and other things that they have to study?
Exactly. In this theory that I've been developing, those students are likely to be ones who are infograzers. And they are made and not born. Such students may have had the experiences, as those in my interviews have told me, of early in their time being treated very, pressured by their teachers to do all sorts of things. And in some cases, they had their love of reading stolen from them at some time. Where an authority figure would say, "What are you reading? That's garbage. You should be studying." And you should be, you've got things you need to be doing. And they lose the notion, they lose the idea of the notion that reading is something that is joyful, and that reading may be something that could help them to get to a better place in their life, to achieve their goals. So what I recommend with such students, and I do recognize that some classes have lots and lots and lots and lots of students, and you may not have the ability to do this, but in the beginnings of your classes, after you've gotten them to reading, and you'll notice those students who don't like to read and they're saying they're too busy, try to find the students as well who like reading. There should be some, especially if your class is not a required class. There will be students who will look around and say, "Oh gosh, I can read and I get a credit for it. What's not to like?" And they will come too. You get these, you try to encourage these students in various activities to share their, mix the students with students who are not, they don't like reading, they don't have a lot of time, they say, with other students who love to read and always have time to read, and develop activities where they share their reading histories, where they share those pivotal points where their love for reading went this way or their dislike for reading went this way. And then you can work with them in these activities to get them closer into thinking, hey, reading can be something that might be fun. Get people to talk about the enjoyment that they get from reading, of the fun that they get. If you get to know the students a little bit better, and other people, students in the class who are avid readers who know them better, get them to recommend books to them. There are so many stories that I came across in my research of people who were at a point where they weren't particularly happy or interested in reading, but there was someone that they kind of liked, and that person looked at them with a twinkle of in their eye and said, "Hey, I think you might like to read this book." And that person, who is probably a story hunter or a book miner, could look at that person, assess where they were at, and give it to them. And it changed their life. And that happens all the time. and it can happen in extensive reading classes. So that's what I would suggest that you would do. I can't give you like an A4 paper and say, here's the activity to do, but I can give you the principles and the concepts, and you can make the activities to fit for your particular students and your particular environment. I hope that helped.
Thank you, Greg. Yes, I mean, I think that this is true for just about every walk of life, where you can easily underestimate the power of people who inspire, people who motivate others to do things. And certainly a near peer is a perfect example. Somebody that you can actually aspire to be would be another student in your class. A set of other questions that have come from a number of the audiences: how would you measure success in reading? I mean, when as a teacher you're presenting a class, in a more regular traditional class there are different ways to measure success and failure with the students. How would you do this with extensive reading?
It's a very good question, and it's a challenge. I do provide all of the students with in my classes with a goal of 200,000 words, and this depending on their and I give them a placement test in the beginning of the course to find out what level of book that they would be able to read, and then assign them a level or two below that. But they are required to hook up to, I've used X Reading or Reader online platforms where students, after they read a book, they'll take an online short quiz, and if they've read the book, the quizzes are very easy, and that quiz will give them an amount, the number of words that are in that book, whether it's 5,000 or 10,000, will give them that in their credit account, and they'll see that they now have 10,000 words towards their goal of 200,000 words. Most students at my university are able to do this. Other places you could set the goal lower, 50,000 words, 100,000 words, 20,000 words, just depending on what you think the students are capable of doing. Now, that goal is a metric that you can then use and turn into, like, maybe for me 200,000 words would be 60%, and anything above that upward will go up to 100% in a semester. You can use it as your metric for that. I also give them regular speed reading tests where they can check to see at the end of class, and they chart their progress every class and to see their improvement there. I ask them to keep a vocabulary log where they keep a log of the new words they've encountered, draw pictures of the words. We use those for activities and such. So we have those, but you can have a student who has read 200,000 words or whatever and has not been successful because they really haven't developed a love or an interest in reading. They just simply had that goal of getting a credit for the class, and they got it, and they walked out, and they go back into infograzing right away. You can also have students who did their best, and they read really, they did their best to read, and they had time issues and such, as well as they said, but they finished 3 or 4 or 5 books, never got even close to the goal, but they were a success because they will come and say, I read this book, I feel good about this, I liked it, and I wanted to read more. And you'll see them sometimes on campus or other places reading a book, and they're enjoying it. And for those students, I give them definitely I have the leeway to do that. If they're succeeding in that way, then they're not going to fail my class because they have developed a love for reading that hopefully will continue for many years in the future, become part of their life. I hope I've answered your question on what I use. I use numbers. Yes.
So in some ways then, I mean, what you're saying is that you need an objective goal for most students to aspire to, and that's something that you can measure them against. But you will always need a subjective element, and that is for you as the teacher to watch how people are reading, their attitude towards it, and the change, of course, in the individual students.
Right.
Related to that, we saw quite a few questions about the nature of infograzers, book miners, and story hunters. One question, I'm going to combine the two together. One was, is there an easy way for teachers to separate out or to classify or to categorize these 3 different types of readers in their class? And the second question, which was related to it, is that is it essentially a progression, and how can you monitor both that progression and also conversely, is there a potential for digression or going back the opposite way, and are there ways that you can stop that?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, those are a lot of questions at the same time. Now, the theory is we're still in the middle of the development, and what I will want to do later on when I get all this research finished is I'll want to create an inventory, a survey where you could give it to your students, where they would identify, their areas of interests and their relationship with reading, and that would help them to help you to find out whether a student is tending towards infograzing, book mining, or story hunting. But you can still do this by just talking with them, by finding out, what's do you really like to read? Not really. Why'd you take the class? Well, I want to improve my English, but well, I couldn't take this other class, so I took your class. Okay, that's cool. That's fine. We're going to read a lot in the class, and maybe we can find something that's interesting for you, and you will improve in your English. Okay, and relate with the student. Find out this might be an infograzer. Let's get that person in relationship with you and other students, so that, because what happens, this is not ready, wasn't ready for the theories, that when you have people that are infograzers, if they don't enter into relationship with others in this reading process, with the book or with other students and with you, is to go into what I'm calling info grinding. And that's where, and you'll see this, where they're simply just trying to pass the class. So they're looking for ways to cheat on the tests, or they'll go and watch movies, and then go and tell you about the book that they saw when they saw the movie. All sorts of different strategies that are coming up in my studies on those. That happens when they're not in relationship. They're isolated. They're still working from their past history. They're not in a place of making anything new, or creating a new history, a new conversation around books, and they'll fall down into that. Now, the question as to watching them progress, yeah, find that you'll just have to talk with you'll have a if you use X Reading or InReader, you'll see in their account what type of books they're reading, and you can get an idea if they're reading a lot of biographies, if they're reading a lot of sort of things of informational stuff. They might be more in terms with book mining. You want to find out maybe what's their cultural studies interest, or why are they interested in this reading. Find out what they're interested in. We work them on towards that goal. Let them go. And the same with the story hunters, looking at what sorts of stories and genres, suggesting other things that will fit within that genre. What will bring them back in? What can cause them to de-avidize? Now, there's lots of things. It could be, it's usually not just one thing, but it can be a lot of crises in the life of a student, some illnesses, changes in where they're living, part-time job or something, a death in the family. These things can knock the wind out of their sails, and or it could be a teacher in another class who has said something, or has assigned something, and they just now that everything's changed. There's a lot of factors, but you'll know that something's happened because their readings will drop off right away, fairly quickly. And it's at that point, if you can start talking to them again and finding if they like to hunt stories or they like to mine books, to help them redevelop that thirst again, or to develop that hunger again. And from that hunger again, or thirsting, that will drive them back out again. You can re-avidize them using the terminology from this theory. Excuse me, sorry.
I think probably then, as we're coming up towards the end of the session, I'd like to leave with one last question, which I think is, also a little bit, it has come up in different forms in the Q&A box. And that is the idea about curating content for students, essentially. How do you go about choosing the content that students can read? And I think I would probably phrase the question, what are the benefits of curating content? And if you do that, should you be thinking about fiction, non-fiction? Should you be pushing people towards more academic texts? And what are the disadvantages of curating content for the students?
Well, I'll have to be honest that I don't curate content for the students. What I have done at my university is I have, with other academics that are here, teachers and academics, provided a self-access learning center. And we have graded readers from virtually every publisher that distributes in Japan. And so I don't curate as much as I use perhaps maybe a shotgun method. I provide as many possible different graded readers out there that are available, and let the students choose. And I know that there are some teachers who do curate, and I've just never, I've never gotten into it. I've never done it. I've never seen the purpose for it. So I would probably be one that would need to learn from you about the virtues of curating content. And again, maybe it's also, I work with university students. If you're working with primary and students or people that are in high school, there may be topics or issues or concepts that probably are inappropriate from certain graded readers at their level. I can't think of any at this moment, but that might be an issue. We don't have to deal with that at my particular venue here in Japan. So I'm afraid I don't have much of an answer for you, with my apologies.
Do you think that there are ever situations related to that where students may feel that fiction is maybe less value to them, and that actually might push them in the wrong direction, trying to read from texts that are a little bit more related to their field or their interest when it's not necessarily at the right level for them?
I don't know. You see, the students that I have interviewed have never indicated that sort of issue. And my classes have not been all Japanese students. My classes are very surprising for me when I've opened up these classes. I have students in my class that are from Japan, but the majority of the students aren't Japanese. They may be German, French, Vietnamese, Chinese, Korean, Russian. I've got a wide range of students, and some of them, it's an undergraduate level class, but I'll have master's students coming in too, because they enjoy the reading. And I have engineers, computer scientists, I have people who are in cultural studies, and I've not encountered any of them feeling that fiction is a bad thing. It may be that the people that I have had coming to my classes have much more of an interest in reading anyway, and so perhaps they, they're not. These are not the type of. Maybe there are other students who would have that problem. So far, I have not encountered that in my study. Fiction is fine if they like it. If they don't like it, some of them don't. Then they read things, more about like stories about famous people and things like that you can find in graded readers.
Thank you very much, Greg.